So those two modeling tools, then we make projections at the stand level and the landscape level over a time period. And so we ran these models out for 100 years, starting with the conditions in 2021. And so we can then use them. They provide a wide range of output, including stand level variables and other variables that we can stratify and quantify at the landscape level. And we can use these to then assess their impacts on some of the different criterion indicators, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the scenarios then that and I'll talk again, describe these in more detail in a minute, but basically these are the 4 scenarios where the status quo, a reduced harvest scenario, an active conservation scenario, and a passive conservation scenario. You can think of the scenarios 1 and 4 as kind of bookend scenarios, where scenario 1 would be kind of the most harvesting, and scenario 2 would be no harvesting. Or sorry, scenario 4 would be no harvesting. Next slide, please. Can I get next slide? There we go. Okay, so here's a table kind of describing, in general terms, the 4 different scenarios. So you can see status quo on the left going over to the scenario 4 of passive conservation on the right. So the first row shows the harvest targets that we put into the landscape level model. Now, the harvest targets they're usually a little lower than what we had hoped to achieve, because the model tends to always hit the minimum amount. And so what we ended up with is the actual harvest cubic meters per year of around 17,500 in the status quo scenario. In the reduced harvest scenario, it drops down to around 7,400 cubic meters per year. In the active conservation scenario, that's down to 1,300 cubic meters per year, but that's only in the first 30 years. And then in the 4th scenario, there's no harvesting. Then you can see in the next row, it shows the actual area that's actually harvested along with that cubic meters. The next one, we also, this table shows that there's no harvesting in any of these scenarios in the preserve area, which is that eastern part of Maple Mountain. We have some built-in timber harvesting land-based block retentions. This is the minimum amount of retention that you would have in any one harvesting block. So in the status quo scenario, it would at least keep 15% of the trees, whereas in the reduced harvesting scenario, you would keep at least 35% of the trees, and then the others, they didn't have these restrictions. The next 2 rows are in relation to the active conservation scenario, which is, these are areas that were identified as having stands that we thin to promote the development of old growth features. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the other one was the woodland restoration. And then the last 2 rows relate to the visual quality objectives. And the 2 things I'd like to highlight here is, so in scenario 2, we used, according to the BC kind of guidelines and regulations for these type of stands, in general, if you have an area that's defined as a retention area, then you should probably try to hit at least 80% retained within a block. If it's one that's identified as a partial retention area, you should probably try to hit around 50. Now, there's some variation around these, and we'll talk more about these later, but I just wanted to bring it up. Now, in scenario 1, when I first ran it, I tried to put the restrictions on the visual quality objective areas at 80 and 50, which is what I use for scenario 2, which is the guidelines. But if I do that, the model is unable to achieve the harvest target of 17,500 cubic meters per year. So in order to achieve that, I had to drop them down to 55% in retention areas and 35% in partial retention areas. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Next slide.